Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, everybody. This is Jay Shapiro. Thanks for listening. According to the Trump plan and with the agreement of the United States, Israel could have annexed the Jordan Valley on the 1st of July. This did not happen. There are a number of reasons. First of all, Israel and many other countries, including the United States, are occupied with the coronavirus. That is what is getting most of their attention. At the same time, the United States is occupied with riots in some of the major cities, something that is entirely new on the American scene. And again, at the same time, our government here in Israel has not gotten its act together. The two major parties, the Likud and the Blue and White, seem to be unable to agree on anything, especially on a budget that will enable the government to operate for the next 1 or 2 years. And in addition to these items, our Prime Minister is under indictment and is facing a court appearance on charges of bribery and corruption. It is hard to understand where he finds time to properly lead the country. And again, at the same time, the United States is facing an election in which the most friendly president to Israel in our nation's history may be replaced by a rival who is weak and controlled by the left wing in his party that happens to be anti-Israel also. And at the same time, the European Union has repeatedly expressed its opposition to annexation. So, in conclusion, if you take all these items into account, you will find that it is truly difficult to decide whether this is a good time for a major step like annexation or any major step. This is also the week of the 9th of Av, which is a disastrous time for the Jews historically, and somehow it seems now that we're riding along the same wavelength. I'll be back after the break. Thanks again for listening.
Always challenging the status quo. Hello, I'm Rod Bryant on Beyond the Matrix here at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. I want to encourage you to listen each week, every Wednesday at the same time, for an amazing show that will challenge you, inform you, and inspire. News, views, and wisdom for the nations here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Don't forget, Beyond the Matrix every week, Wednesday, here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. I'm going to draw heavily on a number of articles that I read recently, and I'll add my own comments because they're very comprehensive articles and they touch upon topics that are very important. One is the upcoming U.S. election, and the article I found was by a man named Uri Wertman, who's listed as a PhD candidate and research assistant at the University of South Wales in the United Kingdom. So I'm going to base a lot of what I say upon his article plus my comments. Basically, in less than 4 months, the U.S. presidential elections will take place, in which the presumptive Republican Party nominee, Donald Trump, who of course is the incumbent, will face presumptive Democratic Party nominee, former Vice President Joe Biden. In Israel, this election is closely monitored, mainly because the results are expected to have an impact on Israeli-U.S. relations and American foreign policy in the Middle East, in particular regarding the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Trump's foreign policy concerning Israel is quite clear. During his tenure, he and his administration proved not only in statements, but mainly in acts, that America strongly supports the Jewish state. For example, Trump transferred the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in December 2017. He withdrew from the nuclear deal with Iran in May 2018 and recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israel in March 2019. Three major moves. Moreover, Trump introduced in January 2020 his plan for an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement, which is really the most pro-Israeli plan an American president has ever put on the table, and includes that Israel would control the Jordan Valley and the settlement blocks. In light of all these acts, it is no wonder that most of the Israeli public and many Jews in the world want to see Trump win the election. On the other hand, most Jews in America vote Democratic as simply as a reaction. That's what they do, Jews. And 85%, roughly, of American Jews vote Democratic, even if Charlie McCarthy was running. That's the way it is. There is a chance, though, if Biden wins the election and becomes the president, a crisis will probably occur in U.S.-Israel relations. As a matter of fact, it's inevitable. Biden spoke against the fact that the American embassy was moved to Jerusalem, and a lot of senior Democratic Party officials, including Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, have already stated that the U.S. should reassess its relations with Israel. And I actually believe that Biden is a weak candidate. I think my impression is that he's physically weak and he's unable to stand up to the hardliners in his party. He continues to express his own support for Israel, and he has been a supporter of Israel in his long political career. However, he is strongly under the influence of the left wing of his party. As a matter of fact, even the centrists in his party, like Nancy Pelosi, are moving very far to the left. And Biden argues that the Palestinian should recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, which of course they refuse to do. In addition, he indicated that the Palestinian Authority should condemn acts of terrorism. They should halt incitement and stop paying salaries to terrorists and their families. By the way, this is simply, these are things that politicians say. They know that the Palestinians are not going to stop paying terrorists and their families. They're not going to halt incitement because that's what the Palestinian Authority does. However, some disagreements between Israel and the United States are expected if Biden wins the presidency. So it's true that Biden has already stated the U.S. Embassy will remain in Jerusalem. I can't imagine him removing the U.S. Embassy back to Tel Aviv. But he has voiced opposition to unilaterally applying Israeli sovereignty to the Jordan Valley and to the settlement blocks. He claims, or his spokesman claimed, that such a unilateral act would harm the two-state solution formula. Now, we know that there is no two-state solution. That died a long time ago. Just the very fact that someone can bring up the two-state solution and use the wording two-state solution shows that whoever says it is completely out of contact with reality. The Palestinians themselves are speaking already. They don't even mention the two-state solution. Moreover, while Biden reiterated that the $3.8 billion U.S. aid to Israel would not be conditioned on the cessation of settlement construction, there is he could call such a linkage, and the left wing of his party would hold him to this linkage. In other words, Israel should essentially follow the American lead, and if not, America is going to punish Israel by cutting back on the U.S. aid. It's interesting. He also said something else. He said that should Iran return to its nuclear commitment, the U.S. under his leadership, Biden's leadership, would return to the nuclear agreement with Iran and work to extend its validity. Meantime, the Iranians are already saying they're not interested in returning to their nuclear commitment. As of early July, Biden's chances of winning the presidential election appear to be very high at the moment. Analysis of the polls within each state clearly illustrates that the state of Israel must begin to prepare for the Biden era in the White House. Remember, in the U.S., it's not the total amount of votes that a candidate gets. It's what he does, how well he does in each individual state. In order to win the presidency, at least 270 electoral votes must be obtained. These polls now show that Biden has 209 compared to just 114 for Trump at the moment, while the battle for the remaining 215 electoral votes is still more or less open. Yet, when adding the states in which one nominee has a slight advantage over the other, it seems at the moment that Biden will receive 279 electoral votes, and only 270 are needed to win the election. In this situation, even if Trump wins the other 68 electoral votes in the swing states where the race is tight, like Florida and Ohio, North Carolina, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, the Biden will still win the election 279 to 259. It's close, but it's a win. In fact, Trump's electoral situation, that even in a state like Texas, which has 38 electoral votes, which since the 1980 election has traditionally voted for a Republican nominee, the race is very close with a slight advantage to Trump. There's only a slight advantage. According to this Uri Workman, who I said is a researcher at the University of South Wales, and I quote him, he said, according to these figures, only a miracle would seem to leave Trump in the White House for a second term. And in conclusion, it appears that Biden's apparent victory in the U.S. presidential election in November should not arouse much concern in Jerusalem. The likelihood that the United States under Biden would become hostile to Israel is unrealistic. Nevertheless, it would be better for Jerusalem to internalize that the Biden area is an inevitable reality. Now, I disagree with that statement. I quoted it because I just want to be honest with the listeners. I believe that the Biden administration would indeed become hostile to Israel for the simple reason that Biden will be beholden to the left wing of his party, because we see that already in the American picture, that even the conservatives and the liberals in the Democratic Party and those in the center all seem now to be following the lead of the left-wing radicals, and therefore I think that Biden would not be strong enough if he were president to really go against them, and they will call the tunes. So the truth of the matter is that Israel must utilize the time left until the U.S. election to conduct unilateral measures on the ground supported by the Trump administration. such as applying sovereignty to the Jordan Valley and to the settlement blocks in order to secure Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state. In other words, I agree very much with this Ori Workman that there's a good possibility that Israel will be unable politically to apply sovereignty to the areas that must remain under Israel no matter what, and they should do it now. I'll be back after the break.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with Love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with Love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Did you know this psalm and many others were composed by a Jewish shepherd and musician who later became a king? Would you like to know some of the inner meanings of psalms to help you connect with God and strengthen your soul? An exciting and easy-to-read book is now available which will help you do just that. Software for the Soul, Psalms for Everyone, available on Kindle, Audible, and Amazon.com. Software for the Soul.
Modesty at the beach? It isn't just about body image, it's about feeling good. Modest swimsuits, so we don't get burned by the sun.
So we won't get ogled by strangers.
So we'll feel free to express ourselves without the need to expose ourselves.
Let Marcy Modest help you to cover up what you want, how you want.
Made in Israel.
Visit marcymodest.com. That's MARSEA modest.com.
And get a 10% discount on your first purchase.
2 new shows on Israel News Talk Radio.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro, and I have to say a few words about the coronavirus. In this age of the virus, this is a time of great uncertainty, and the truth of the matter is, as far as I can tell, nobody has the answers. The outgoing president of the World Medical Association, someone named Leor Edelman, said, and I quote, "The most important lesson in looking at the world and seeing what's happening is that with the corona, we never know what will be the next step, what the next day will bring. It is a virus of which the world simply does not have enough information to make any predictions. And those who do predict likely later have to explain why what they predicted didn't happen. For example, back in March, when the coronavirus began upending our lives and there was a shortage of readily available masks, The health officials went on the air and said that the masks were not very effective anyhow. That was in March. Now they turned around and the public has been ordered to wear the mask and fined if they did not. You get a fine here in Israel of 500 shekels. It's a lot of money if you're not wearing a mask. As of Monday, the number of coronavirus deaths in Israel stood at 473. By the way, we have a Chinese friend who just called us from Taiwan and told us that in Taiwan, a huge country much, much bigger than Israel, much bigger population, there have so far been only 10 coronavirus deaths. They really crack down on people who don't wear masks and keep social distance and so forth. And all this is very unsettling. Modern man likes certainty. It gives us a sense that we are in control, which is why science holds such an exalted position in modern culture. It provides certainty. Now, who is a modern man going to believe? The politicians? Certainly not. They bend the truth to fit their own interests. How about religious leaders? Should we believe them? No, because they're blinded by their faith in most cases. How about believing journalists? No, I don't think so. They often push their own agenda. But scientists are the address for certainty, according to most people. But that may no longer be true. With the politicians sending out contradictory messages about the virus, with religious leaders giving advice going against public health decrees, with journalists reporting one thing one day and the opposite the next day, who is the public to look to for guidance and for truth? So we say, you know what? It must be the scientists who have the truth, except that the science on the coronavirus is imperfect and very much still a work in progress. The scientists and health officials that we hear so much from are often quite wrong, as is proven within a few days. Essentially, they're just as wrong as the politicians and all the news people and all the pundits. But we have to admit that the scientists are trying to do their job. Research is taking place at a great pace, which is admirable, except it has a downside as well. Since the world is so impatient for answers, research is placed out there in the public domain, and decisions are based on it without that research being properly checked out and vetted. And that is a serious, really serious problem. The research is not holy. In the race to find a cure for the coronavirus, apparently nobody has time to wait a year for research to go through the proper peer review before seeing the light of day. So what has happened is there have been cases where scientific articles found their way into the public discussion that were based on partial or faulty research. Now, perhaps this can be forgiven, because the argument being that desperate times call for shortcuts in research to come up with a cure. However, what is more difficult to excuse, however, is media reporting on the crisis that is not based on fact and just adds to the confusion. For instance, earlier this week, on Monday, there were a number of reports of hospitals here in Israel already breaking under the weight of patients of coronavirus, with Hadassah University Medical Center in Jerusalem, which is a major center here, it was reportedly actually turning away patients, except, according to the hospital itself, it did not turn away patients. For a brief time, the hospital was swamped in its emergency room, and a few patients were directed to the sister hospital on Mount Scopus. There is a major Hadassah University Medical Center in Ein Kerem, and all the way at the other end of the city, There is a sister campus on Mount Scopus near the Hebrew University. But this turning away patients was temporary. It was not as if the coronavirus ward could not absorb any more patients. At the worst case scenario, the hospitals had already become overwhelmed. This simply did not happen. According to a Central Bureau of Statistics survey this week, only 47% of the public said they had either a great deal or some confidence in the government's ability to deal with this virus. This figure was down from 69% who said they had confidence back in May, and 71% who answered the same question in early May. This means there's been about a 25% drop in public confidence in the government in 2.5 months. And one of the reasons for that lack of confidence is surely because there's a credibility gap, because the public, as a result of mixed messages and flip-flops in policy from the government, the public has lost faith in the government's ability to deal with the crisis. But the difficulty is not only with the government. The problem is that so much information is out there, and there's no dissemination of how proper or how realistic the information is. Everybody can go onto the internet. Everybody can give out their own thoughts. And some of it is misleading or wrong, sometimes intentionally and sometimes not. So the problem is it's increasingly difficult to know whom to believe. This is an acutely unhealthy situation for a country to be in while dealing with a virus of mammoth proportions. It's very interesting. We know as the information ability of people to communicate grew, we're all very happy. Everybody can send out their own personal message. The problem is that not everybody is honest and not everybody knows what they're talking about. So we have a situation now where there is a tremendous amount of information available on just about every subject. Some of it is trivial, it doesn't matter, and some of the subjects are of vital importance, like the coronavirus. And there is no filter out there, so we can separate facts from fiction and from rumor. This is a very serious problem in what I guess we can call the communication age. I remember 20 or 30 years ago when the communication became easier and more people can get onto the internet, more people can give out their opinions. This was thought to be a good thing because that would avoid censorship and everybody could say what they thought. That's a very good thing. The problem is that by and large, there's no filter, and a lot of information gets out there which is not based on reality, and some of the information is in areas of importance. One of the most important areas today for the average person is what's happening in the coronavirus. So there is a huge coronavirus credibility gap where you don't know whom to believe or what to believe, and that's a very serious problem. It's a problem that didn't exist before the age of vast communication and ease of communication, but has now become a reality, and it's become a reality in a field that's very important, our health. So, not every new thing is a blessing. Some are mixed blessings, and some are more negative than positive. That's a serious problem we're living in now. And unfortunately, it's happening with a subject like the coronavirus, which is essentially a problem or an issue, if you will, of life and death. And therefore, we are now being overloaded with information, and we can't separate the wheat from the chaff. And that is a very serious problem. really a serious problem. And I just wanted to share my thoughts about it with the readers. Obviously, I don't have a solution. I don't know if there is a solution. I'll be back after the break.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Bentako, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany's but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. In this section of the program, I first want to discuss something that I saw in a book that I just read. The writer of the book is a political scientist at a university in Sweden. His name is Anders Persson. I had never heard about him before, but I came across this new book that he wrote, which is called EU Diplomacy and the Israeli-Arab Conflict, 1967 to 2019. The book was just published at the beginning of the month. And I want to share some thoughts that he wrote there for what they're worth. He says that full Israeli annexation means that there will not be a true peace between Israel and her neighbors. Now, I think this is true in general, with and without full annexation. But he's basing the fact that there will be no true peace on annexation. He claims that this will redefine Europe's role in the region in a way not seen since the oil crisis almost 50 years ago. Now, at the moment, annexation could have happened on July 1st. It did not happen. It did not happen yet. Much can still happen in this region between now and the American election and in general. However, if Israel goes ahead and annexes all its settlements in the 30% of the West Bank where they are located, according to the Trump plan, it will be the greatest challenge that Europe has faced in the conflict since the oil crisis after the 1973 Yom Kippur War. It will be a game-changing event that will redefine Europe's relations with the entire region for decades to come, just like the oil crisis did. The dependence of the European Union on oil was laid bare for all to see back in the 1967 Six-Day War, when the European Union, at that time it was called the European Community, the official bulletin reported that they depended for 80% of oil consumption, 48% of its total supply of power on the Arab members of OPEC. a figure much higher at the time than both of the superpowers did. The oil dependency became an acute matter after the war in 1973, when the oil-producing states instigated an oil boycott against countries that were considered supportive of Israel. It resulted in a price hike from $3 per barrel to nearly $12 per barrel. Even if the boycott was short-lived, the price hike led to massive transfers of wealth from the industrialized world to the oil producers in the Middle East. So oil and trade, together with the increased attention to the Palestinians living under Israel's military occupation, completely redefined Europe's relations with the Middle East after 1973. It led to much worse relations with Israel, much better relations with the Palestinian and other Arabs, and led to the Israeli-Arab conflict to become the most important conflict that interested Europe, and has continued till now. If Israel would fully annex the settlements in the Judea and Samaria, it would be an event the same magnitude as 1973, or perhaps even bigger, because it will mean that there will not be a true peace between Israel and her neighbors for the foreseeable future. Now, by the way, I don't think this is big news. There's no true peace between Israel and her neighbors in the foreseeable future without annexation. So maybe annexation may be a blow, not just against the relations between the European Union and its member states vis-a-vis Israel, but against the European Union's relations with the Palestinian Authority as well, and perhaps the security architecture of the whole region will change. It most likely will not lead to any harsher punitive actions against Israel in the immediate aftermath, because there's no consensus and little appetite in the European Union at this moment to confront either Israel or especially to confront the Trump administration. Over the long run, however, it's difficult to see Israel becoming more deeply integrated into the European Union after an annexation takes place. The European Union has never recognized the annexation of the Golan Heights and East Jerusalem, which the Trump administration did, and it is inconceivable that the European Union will recognize the annexation of these settlements in what's called the West Bank. The European Union's relations with the Palestinians are even more complicated than those with Israel because of its enormous financial investment in the institutions of the Palestinian Authority. The European Union will be reluctant to pronounce the death of the two-state solution, especially before the Palestinian Authority officially says the two-state solution is dead. They act as though the two-state solution is dead, but they never really announced it. And the European Union will also be reluctant to punish the Palestinians for something Israel has done by cutting aid too much. At the same time, the European Union's former High Representative, a lady named Federica Mogherini, said just before she left office last year that if the prospect of a two-state solution disappears or no longer appears achievable, the European Union and other donors would need to fundamentally review their support. So that moment may arrive the day after annexation. Now, a full Israeli annexation will certainly not mean peace, but that conflict will go on, and I think it would go on with or without annexation, because the Palestinians include even in their educational system that they teach their children that Israel has no right to exist. So whether there is annexation or there isn't annexation, nothing is really going to change. So all these analysts in the European Union, like the one whose book I just read, are basing it's sort of I think the word is chimeric. They talk about as annexation would make any difference. I don't think it will. So a full Israeli annexation won't really change anything. The conflict is going to go on anyhow, and the whole area here will continue to be destabilized for the foreseeable future. And I think that is true with or without annexation. It will inevitably mean that Europe's obsession with the Israeli-Arab conflict will continue. The Europeans are obsessed with the Arab-Israel conflict. They're pouring millions, billions perhaps, of dollars or euros into all kind of organizations within the Palestinian Authority, many of whom are terrorist organizations, and many of whom are educational organizations. But the education that they provide to the children essentially is that Israel has no right to exist. So all these people, like this expert from Sweden, who think annexation will be a game changer for Europe's role in the Middle East, I do not believe that it will be true. Europe leans toward the Palestinians, has done so consistently, and I believe it will do so with or without annexation. In the meantime, the Israeli government cannot get its act together in order to even think about annexation because they're busy trying to solve the problem of the coronavirus. That's what is on everybody's mind. So we're in an interesting situation. It's a little, I think, 4 months until the American election. It's hard to know who is going to be the American president next year. And it's even if it's the Democrats, the Democratic candidate, if he becomes president, is going to be so influenced by the left wing in his party that it will probably be not pro-Israel. So we're in a very difficult time. And whether or not Israel actually sometime in the next 4 months annexes the Jordan Valley, I really don't believe it'll make that much difference in our relationship with the European Union, and all these experts who write books seem to think it will, but I think somehow they're not close to reality. The reality is that the Arabs still teach their children that Israel has no right to exist, with or without annexation. So it's nice to know that there are all kind of experts writing about what annexation will do. I don't know if it will make any difference. Until next time, then, Jay Shapiro signing off. Take care of yourselves.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.